while the minister says the system is healthier than the previous festive season, South Africa has experienced close to 7,000 hours of load shedding so far this year. To reflect on the country's power crisis in 2023, I'm now joined by Nick Hedley, who is a sustainable development researcher and energy columnist. Nick, good to have you, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Can we speak of a healthy system, venture a view on that at a time when the biggest users of electricity are actually on recess, having a holiday?
I think it's fair to say that the system is slightly healthier than it was before, but it's still in a very precarious state. So the latest stats from Eskom show that the energy availability factor of our power plants is still below 55%, which is really low and obviously a lot lower than the minister's targets. One thing that's quite encouraging is that unplanned outages have declined a little bit. So that's really tripping plants. And planned maintenance has increased, exactly as the minister said. So that's quite encouraging. But we are in the summer months when demand for electricity is relatively low and maintenance generally does ramp up anyway. So I wouldn't get too excited personally. Eskom's plants, as we all know, have been kind of very poorly maintained over the past 15 years or so, and they're still very prone to breaking down. And once we sort of head into next year and industry starts ramping up again, and then we get into the winter months, things will probably get quite tough. Yeah. It does kind of sound like we're in for another couple of years of load shedding at the very least, so I wouldn't get too excited just yet.
So the minister pointing out to Kendal as an area of concern when it comes to emissions. We know that in Kusile, for us to get those 4 units to be giving us the power that they're giving us right now, it's because some relaxation had to be applied for with the Minister of Environmental Affairs, Barbara Creasy. So are we likely looking at getting like heavy fines, others are saying, for close to about 8,500 megawatts of power that we're generating in a way that is unclean?
Yeah, there's big trade-offs to be made. On the one hand, we'll obviously have that power online, which is the country needs desperately. We need all the power we can get. But on the other hand, there's those communities that are very close to those power stations are really kind of taking one for the team, to put it very lightly. The amount of excess deaths recorded in those areas is really high. There's a lot of studies showing that, and a lot of respiratory diseases and things like that. So kind of good for the country, but it's a tough time for people living close to those plants.
So the minister suggesting today that they are actually in conversations, maybe even with Treasury, for an extended package of incentives that would include inverters and batteries, which I didn't know at this particular point that they were actually not included in those incentives. And he says if we could do that, there's a study that he is citing, if it's not in Germany, it's in one of the European countries, where we could see close to 8,000 megawatts actually being brought into the system by those who would take up those incentives.
That's fantastic. I must be honest, I haven't seen that report, but this is really the way to go. If you look at what happened in Vietnam in 2020, I think it was, Vietnam was facing a power crunch itself, and it was sort of at risk of having blackouts just like we are. And the government sort of got on top of that before it became an issue by incentivizing installations of rooftop solar and batteries. And in just 1 year alone, Vietnam added 9 gigawatts of rooftop solar, that's massive. We struggled to add that amount of capacity in a decade. And this was purely just on Vietnam's rooftops. So there's plenty of examples of this around the world, and how it's helping both households with household finances and averting broader electricity constraints. So definitely the way to go.
Tutuka is a mess, according to even the minister. He admits himself, hence he has sent what he calls his bomb squad there to try and deal with the issues. What do you think are some of the major issues there that they would need to address?
So Tutuka is one of it seems like the most neglected power stations over the years. Most of our power stations haven't received the maintenance that they needed to, and a lot of that is obviously due to corruption. Tutuka, by all accounts, has been particularly hard hit by corruption and sort of dodgy dealings going on there, as well as sabotage. And it's in one of the worst states of all of our power fleet. It's going to take a lot to turn around and a lot of resources, and it's in a tough place.
Yeah. Overall, the question is around being able to sustain this kind of win that they are looking at. At some point, he admits that they were quite quick to celebrate when actually they still had some number of issues to deal with. But the question now is where we are. What are the prospects of at least sustaining this when we come back in January and the industry begins to open up again?
I mean, we definitely face more load shedding. Eskom's weekly system report says next year we have the risk of load shedding, deep load shedding every single week. So really nothing to celebrate just yet. We have a sort of huge wave of new power projects in the pipeline that are due to come online, but a lot of those are still in their sort of early phases or construction phases, so it's going to take time to add additional capacity to the grid. And in the meantime, we have a big and possibly growing shortfall of electricity. Another 5 of Eskom's coal-fired power plants are scheduled to reach their end of life by the end of the decade. So that means that unless we really ramp up the amount of capacity we're adding to the grid over the next couple of years, the capacity shortage could even grow. So there's growing risks. There's obviously a lot in the pipeline, and that's fantastic to see, but we need to really step up our ambition still.
Yeah, I think he said something close to 66 gigawatts, if I heard him correctly, but that will be coming from private sector at various stages of completion and being brought onto the grid. So by and large, the biggest consumers of electricity, I suppose, will be our saving grace.
Absolutely, yeah. Like you say, there's 66 gigawatts in the pipeline, which is massive. That's a little bit more than we actually need to 2035 to secure energy security. The problem there, though, is that we've also, besides neglecting our power stations, we've neglected our national grid. So in the Cape provinces, Western Cape, Northern Cape, Eastern Cape, there's no longer any capacity to connect any new power projects. So a lot of developers are moving obviously inland and looking at KZN. But even there's only a combined roughly 20 gigawatts of capacity. We can obviously expand grid capacity in some relatively simple ways. For example, by adding batteries or just upgrading substations, you can unlock quite a bit of additional capacity. But we need to start seriously investing in the grid to really unlock that big full pipeline of projects.
Nick Hedley, much appreciated. Thank you very much for coming on this afternoon, energy columnist there. Nick Hedley on the announcement earlier on being made by the Minister of Electricity, saying we're in a much better position this festive season than we were the previous one.